This took place in Seolmari, Jeokseongyeon, Paju, near the Imjin River that flows toward the north with Gamak Mountain rising in the south. This town was a hard-fought field during the Korean War, and here's the war monument established for the British Army. This was erected to pay tribute to the memory of the 29th Brigade, Gloucestershire soldiers who fought against a major offensive from Communist China. Every April, the people of this place invite veterans to pay tribute to the memory of the British Army soldiers who participated in the Korean War. About 60 years ago, there was a tragic history, the Korean War that youths from this country and others had to fight at the risk of their lives. Also, the Battle of Imjin River, which must never be forgotten. At 4 a.m. on June 25th, in 1950, the Korean War began with a sudden attack of North Korean forces. The Korean Army was deprived of its capital city, Seoul, within 3 days of attacking North Korea, who was fully equipped with Soviet Union-made tanks and weapons. After the outbreak of war, the U.S. administration received requests for support from the Korean government and instantly instituted United Nations Security Council contingencies. On June 30th, 16 countries, including the United States and Great Britain, made agreements to participate in the Korean War. President Seung-man Lee turned over the reins of Armistice Operational Command to General MacArthur to perform his war tasks. The Korean Army and UN forces staged a fierce rally with combined operations against North Koreans. The UN forces that had operational command finally held the enemy in check at the Nakdong River and built the ultimate line of defense for counterattack operations. A large counterattack toward North Korean forces began following the Incheon landing operation. With the proposal of General MacArthur, the Incheon landing operations that occurred on the dawn of September 15, 1950 were successful. The Korean Army and UN forces who built the ultimate line of defense on the Nakdong River then started to attack toward the north. On September 28th, the Korean Army and United Nations forces recovered the capital city, Seoul. On October 1st, the 3rd Division of the Korean Army first broke through the 38th parallel. President Seung-man Lee entered Pyongyang and was warmly welcomed by its residents. The Korean Army and United Nations forces swept away everything in their path toward the north and finally advanced to the line adjoining Parkcheon, Wonsan, Onjeongri, and Heechon. On October 25, 1950, the Communist Chinese Army began the first offensive at a late stage, when the Korean Army and United Nations forces had almost finished the war. The United Nations forces, who missed the fact that the Communist Chinese Army largely sponsored the North Korean Army during the war, sustained many losses after the second attack of the Chinese Army. They had to withdraw operations on November 30th, 71 days after the Incheon landing. The Chinese Army broke through the 38th parallel with its third offensive. Finally, the United Nations forces decided to give up Seoul and move the line from Pyeongtaek to Samcheon on January 4, 1951. At this point, the UN forces prepared a counterattack with superior firepower for weakening the Chinese Army's force as it recognized that the Chinese Army had less offensive capabilities. On March 15, 1951, after recapturing Seoul, the Korean Army and the United Nations forces advanced through the 38th parallel to the Kansas line. As springtime began to bloom in April, the battlefield situation which had preceded smoothly changed. The spring offensive, which was the fifth attack of the Communist Chinese Army. While the Korean Army and UN forces successfully conducted counterattack operations, a leader of Red Army recognized that they must accept unfavorable conditions if they entered negotiations at that time. Therefore, the Chinese Red Army launched a large attack and reclaimed Seoul in order to change the war situation. The UN forces created the operational concept to withdraw to the planned control zone while inflicting as much damage as possible upon the enemy. Then, they conducted their counterattack. The 29th Brigade of the British Army and the 1st Division of the Korean Army had the duty to defend along the Imjin River and the main line of resistance against the north. The 29th Brigade of the British Army defended the area from Majiri to Dogampo, their left flank, as Somari and Gamak Mountain was defended by Gloucestershire Battalion. The Gloucestershire Battalion organized a stronghold defense in front of the Gamak Mountain by ordering Alpha Company to occupy the mountain Jungsong, Delta Company to capture Highland 187, Bravo Company to get Ukbekuni, and Charlie Company to occupy Highland 150. The Gloucestershire Battalion frontline remained quiet without any movement. From April 20th to the 21st, they attempted to find the Chinese army with the light armored troops tanks, but could not see any movement north of the Imjin River. On April 22nd, they found a few Chinese army soldiers moving towards the river crossing region near Gayaoyu. Although there were only a few, the commander found it strange, so he ordered more forces around the border and concealed the Charlie Company in ambush in case of enemy attack. At 10 p.m., the moonlight revealed 7 people crossing the Imjin River. An ambush team of the Gloucestershire Battalion, watching the enemy from a cliff along the river, fired a machine gun and annihilated the enemy. However, at that moment, many more enemy troops had begun to rush into the river while yelling and firing their weapons. The Gloucestershire Battalion impeded the enemy's crossing operation with trench mortar and machine guns. The flash of trench mortar over the Imjin River was never-ending fire. After a little while, however, the Communist Chinese Army carried out the crossing of the river again by committing more troops. Offensive of the Communist Chinese was certainly a ceaseless commitment, a human wave strategy itself. When one fell down to the ground, the Communist Chinese Reserve continually filled the spot. In spite of continuous mortar and machine gun fire, the Chinese army constantly continued the river crossing operation. Eventually, the ambush team ran out of ammunition and was forced to withdraw. Finally, the Gloucestershire Battalion allowed the Red Army to cross the river on the morning of April 23rd. The Chinese Red Army continued an attack toward the Jungsong Mountain with great force. In spite of the British Army's artillery fire, the Chinese Red Army concentrated their forces on main dash line to carry on the offensive. Although Delta Company defended Highland 187 by keeping off the ceaseless attack of Chinese Red Army, Alpha Company eventually was deprived of Jungsong Mountain in a desperate fight. At 8:30 a.m. on April 23rd, the commander ordered Alpha and Delta Companies to retreat when he saw that they could not hold the current position under the Chinese Red Army's human wave tactics. The soldiers fought well enough to cause some damage to the Chinese Red Army, but their main mission was to check the Red Army's advance. Retreated from Jungsong Mountain and Highland 187, Alpha and Delta Companies were positioned at key sites at Highland 235, and Bravo and Charlie Companies were stationed at Highland 318 and 150 to slow down the Chinese Red Army's advance. At night, the Red Army began the attack again. They moved towards the mountain Gamak's main passage to cut off the Gloucestershire Battalion retreat, and Bravo and Charlie Companies became the main targets. With their advantage in troop strength, the Chinese Red Army overpowered Charlie Company, and the Gloucestershire Battalion eventually lost their position at Highland 318. The enemy could monitor our soldiers moving in the valley at this point. Therefore, the Gloucestershire Battalion ordered the headquarters and Delta Company to pull back to Highland 235 away from the valley, and Bravo and Charlie Companies to retreat as well. Meanwhile, Due to the Chinese Red Army's constant attack, many troops near the Gloucestershire Battalion were forced to retreat. After the failed counterattack by the battalion, they found themselves in the middle of the enemy's territory. On the morning of April 24th, as the UN forces' airstrike began, the enemy concealed themselves in the woods and the valley. Meanwhile, the Gloucestershire Battalion established a full defensive position at Highland 235 to prepare for the Chinese Red Army's attack at night. In the morning, the U.S. force tried to break through the enemy line with the battalion from the Philippines. One tank company attempted to rescue the isolated Gloucestershire Battalion, but failed. The Chinese Red Army began an intense attack against the isolated Gloucestershire Battalion. At night on April 24th, the Gloucestershire Battalion added another division to defend themselves against the Chinese Red Army's wave attacks and did not surrender to the enemy. On the morning of April 25th, the Chinese added a reserve division to launch a full attack. The 8th Army Corps ordered a full retreat. To make things worse, the support artillery unit was assailed, so artillery support was impossible. At this point, the brigade commander ordered Gloucestershire Battalion to withdraw. In response, the battalion commander ordered a pullback of troops under Delta Company's cover, and he himself chose to stay behind at the Highland with a chaplain, some doctors, and the wounded. In the end, Gloucestershire Battalion, headed by Alpha Company, began to withdraw from Highland 235 toward the south. The enemy fired a machine gun intentionally in front of the Gloucestershire Battalion that was traveling through the narrow valley in line. While the Gloucestershire Battalion was fighting in isolation, the Chinese Red Army acquired major ridges in Highlands. After protecting the battalion members who advanced from Highland 235, Delta Company was the last to retreat and headed in the opposite direction to the north to join with the 1st Army Division, as they were the only successful force in connecting tactics. On April 29th, the Chinese Red Army's attack on Seoul failed because they couldn't overcome the damage from proper control of the lines and greater firepower of the Korean Army and UN forces. This 5th attack of the Chinese Red Army, intended to occupy Seoul until Labor Day, failed in the end. The struggle for Highland near the 38th parallel continued through the Armistice Agreement on July 10, 1951, as well as during the 159th Main Conference and 765 subsidiary conferences. The Korean War finally ended with an armistice agreement signed on July 27, in 1953. The Chinese Red Army tried to annihilate the 1st Division of Korean Army and 29th Brigade of British Army positioned on the western line at the north of Seoul, making them turn east to Uijeongbu to block their retreat. The 29th British Brigade positioned itself at the south of the Imjin River, where the Chinese Red Army's 19th Corps had to pass in order to get around to Uijeongbu, and completed the defensive mission, while the Gloucestershire Battalion was isolated at Highland 235, located at the end of the mountain Gamak, for 3 days. They desperately defended the battle line to disrupt the Chinese Red Army's plan to block the UN Army's path of retreat. The desperate fight of Gloucestershire Battalion for 3 days, highly attributed to blocking the Communist Chinese Army's attack of Seoul, which almost became the retreat of January 4th. They delayed the advance of the Communist Chinese Army and bought time for reorganizing UN forces. The Korean War was a war that 16 countries entered into to impede an invader and guard peace and freedom in this land. Furthermore, the British Army deployed 56,000 people, the second largest troop commitment after the United States. The Battle of Imjin River, Use with Blue Eyes fought bravely against the superior Communist Chinese Army for strangers in an unfamiliar place. We must remember and remind those whom the youths with blue eyes died gloriously for, and the valuable sacrifices they made for freedom and peace. The Republic of Korea will remember your courage and sacrifice forever. Thank you.